Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is that you are listening to or watching this episode. I'm your host, Paul Weaver, and it is my privilege to lead conversations, discussions about all things Bible and theology. And I'm thrilled to have as my guest on today's episode, Dr. Frank Turek. Dr. Turek is a well-known Christian apologist, author, and speaker recognized for his articulate defense of the Christian faith and his engaging seminars and radio program entitled Cross-Examined. Dr. Turek speaks on topics related to apologetics, atheism, morality, and philosophy. Dr. Turek earned a degree in aerospace engineering from North Carolina State University and a master's degree in public administration from George Washington University. He earned a second master's degree in Christian apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. He also earned a doctorate in apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. Dr. Turek is the president of crossexamined.org. He's the author and co-author of several books, including Correct, but Not Politically Correct, Stealing from God, and Legislating Morality. He's also the co-author of the influential book we are discussing today in today's episode, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which explores the rationality of belief in God and in the person of Jesus Christ and the irrationality of atheism. Dr. Turek, thank you for joining me on the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Well, in the introduction to your introductory chapter of your book, you explain that the writings of other Christian apologists that persuaded you that God exists and that the Judeo-Christian faith is indeed the correct one. Would you share a little bit about your journey to faith in Christ and into the realm of Christian apologetics that ultimately resulted in you writing this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I was brought up Catholic because I'm from New Jersey, and it's the law, Paul. That's why. And I went to Catholic high school, and I always believed in God because I knew there had to be a first cause. I kind of had the natural law argument, there's got to be a cause to all this, but I never really knew who Jesus was. And it wasn't until I went into the Navy and into flight school that I met the son of a Methodist minister. And I had so many questions for him that he finally said, look, you just need to get Josh McDowell books, Evidence Demands a Verdict and More Than a Carpenter. So I read those books, and I realized there's evidence that Christianity's true. And then when I got out of the Navy in 1992, I ran into Dr. Norman Geisler, former professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, and he was starting a new seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And one thing led to another. Within 6 months, my wife and our 3 kids, 5 and under, moved from the D.C. area to Charlotte, North Carolina, to attend Southern Evangelical Seminary, and that was 30 or so years ago now. And I had the occasion a couple of times to write books with Dr. Geisler. The first one was called Legislating Morality. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. All laws legislate morality. And then we wrote a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which was really based on Norm's outline he'd been using for years to show from the ground up that Christianity's true. And because we were going around the country doing a seminar called The 12 Points That Show Christianity's True. And I finally said, look, this needs to be a book. So we sat down and wrote, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist.
Well, that's great. I love the book, and it does give a very systematic approach in walking through from giving proofs or evidence for God's existence to the Judeo-Christian faith, and I really appreciate that. Well, in the introductory chapter of your book, you write, while some faith is required for our conclusions, it's often forgotten that faith is also required to believe any worldview, including atheism. Would you explain, Dr. Turek?
Yeah, I had a friend of mine, his name is Cliff Kneckley, and he goes to college campuses like we do. He had a girl say to him once on a college campus, I can't believe the resurrection unless I have 100% proof. And he said, ma'am, you don't live your life that way. I mean, if a doctor gives you a prescription and then you bring it to the pharmacist and you bring the prescription home, do you take out a chemical kit and try and discover if the prescription really is what it's supposed to be? Or when you go to a restaurant, do you, after you order your food, have a food taster or some sort of poison kit to try and discover whether or not your food is poison? No, you don't live with 100% proof on virtually anything. You have to have some faith or trust, but you have good evidence to believe you ought to trust the meal that you get at a restaurant here in America. So faith isn't blind. Faith isn't, I have no evidence, I'm just going to believe, or I'm just going to believe in spite of the evidence. Faith is trusting in what you have good evidence to believe. Trusting in what you have good evidence to believe. And I think atheists have to have a lot more faith than Christians, because we really have good evidence that God exists and Jesus rose from the dead, and ultimately the Bible's true. So it's easy for us to say, well, we can trust in what we have good evidence to believe. I think it's much harder for an atheist or somebody of another faith position, if they're honest, if they've looked at the evidence, to say, well, I really got good evidence for this position. I don't think they have a good evidence for their position. I think we have good evidence that Christianity is indeed true. So we're trusting in the evidence that we have.
And in my classes, before I start my first course or first class of the semester, which we just started, I always talk about presuppositions. Everyone has them, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
Christians, we have them, and I think we have the right presuppositions. But a lot of times atheists want to deny that they have presuppositions, but they presuppose there's no supernatural, or they presuppose that the Bible is not God's word, and approach things with a presuppositional perspective too.
Let me say one thing about that, because when they presuppose there's no supernatural, often they'll say, well, everything occurs by natural laws. If that's the case, they shouldn't believe anything they think. Because if they're just a molecular machine, if they're just a moist robot, if everything they think is the result of the laws of physics, then why should they believe anything they think, including the idea that atheism's true? So this idea that everything happens completely by natural law, and there is no immaterial realm, there's no metaphysical realm, there's no spiritual realm, that particular assertion itself isn't made of molecules. That particular assertion itself is presumed not to come just by molecules bumping around in our heads. If it does come from molecules bumping around in our heads, we have no warrant to believe it. So ultimately, this hard naturalism, this idea that there can be no supernatural realm, defeats reason itself. And C.S. Lewis, of course, made that famous in, I think, The Problem of Pain, when he talked about that. You know, there's no way you should believe anything if materialism's true.
Very good. Well, I'm excited to get into your book here, Dr. Turk. In the second chapter of your book, entitled Can We Handle the Truth?, you provide some helpful clarifications of the nature of truth. And I love the movie illustration you use for that, right? Can you handle the truth? Would you share some of the principles with us from that chapter?
Well, truth is what corresponds to reality. And in our culture, a lot of people think there is no truth. You know, the postmodern idea that there's no overarching truth. And so what we do in that chapter of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist is we point out how to identify self-defeating claims. And what you do is you turn the claim on itself. So if someone says there is no truth, you simply ask, is that true? Is it true that there's no truth? Because if it's true that there's no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true. And so many people make this mistake. They'll say everything's relative. You ask them, is that relative? No, that's an absolute claim. Or they'll say there is no the truth, only my truth. And then you simply ask them, is that the truth or just your truth? Because if it's just your truth, why should I believe it? But if you're saying it's the truth, that there are no the truths, you've just defeated yourself. It's kind of like saying I can't speak a word in English. If I were to say that, you'd say, well, you just use English to say it. And so in that chapter of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, we're showing people how to identify self-defeating statements. And for me anyway, this is the most important thinking skill I've ever learned, because so much of the false philosophies that we see out there are literally self-defeating. They can't be true. They violate the law of non-contradiction, like the one we just talked about, materialism. It's practically self-defeating to say everything's made of molecules, because first of all, that very statement isn't made of molecules. And secondly, your reasoning that brought you to that position, if that was just molecules, you should have no reason to believe it.
We can learn some rules of logic as we work in the realm of apologetics. Isn't that true?
It's critical. Critical thinking, courses in logic. In fact, I always ask audiences I speak to, who in here has taken a formal course in logic? And about 5% of the hands go up, and I say, look, here are the homeschoolers, right? We don't teach logic anymore. If we taught logic in public school, things would be a lot better. Instead of teaching kids how to think, we're teaching them what to feel, and that's dangerous.
Right. And you hit on that point, my truth versus your truth. That's dangerous as well, isn't it?
It is. There's no such thing as my truth. There's just the truth. If someone were to say, I have my own truth, you just ask him, do you have your own math too? No, you don't have your own. There's not my math or your math. There's just math. There's not my truth or your truth. There's just truth.
Well, in that same chapter, you also have a section entitled Truth versus Tolerance. Would you please highlight this distinction in light of the day and age in which we live?
Yeah, well, tolerance used to mean respecting other people even if you disagree with their views. Now it means if you don't celebrate my view, you're intolerant. You don't, you're a bigot or these kind of ad hominem attacks. And what you need to do when people say things like that is, what do you mean by bigotry? Because as soon as they try and define it, they're going to be in trouble. You're saying I'm a bigot because I don't agree with you? Does that make you a bigot because you don't agree with me? No, bigotry is not disagreeing with people. Bigotry is having a firm position on something without having researched it and then not being open to being corrected. And that's not what I'm trying to do. I have a case for my position. Here it is. In fact, at one point I had a same-sex marriage advocate call me a bigot because I wrote a book called Correct, Not Politically Correct about same-sex marriage and transgenderism. And I said, what do you mean by bigotry? He said, fear and intolerance. I said, that's not the definition of bigotry. I gave the definition I just mentioned. And I said, sir, with all due respect, if anyone's a bigot in this conversation, it's you, because you are judging my position without knowing what my position is or why I hold it. I've written an entire book on this topic, which you haven't read. And you are calling me a bigot? No, that's just there to shut you up. And so I think we need to tactfully call people out on that. And by the way, love does not mean approval. In our country, we think if you love somebody, you have to approve of them. Everybody that is a parent knows this isn't the case, because if you're a parent and you approve of everything your 12-year-old wants to do, you're not loving, you're unloving, you're enabling them to do evil. You need to stand in the way of evil. And this is why Paul, in the chapter everyone reads at their wedding, but nobody obeys, 1 Corinthians 13, says things like, love always protects. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing. Love rejoices in the truth. Love always perseveres. Love, in other words, doesn't mean approval necessarily. It means seeking what's best for the loved one. And that means you need to stand in the way of the evil they want to do. You don't tolerate what they want to do. You stand in the way of it. We need to get back to that. And that's, of course, the entire Bible, being a Bible professor, the entire Bible is trying to correct people on their bad behavior. It's not approving of the bad behavior. It's not approving of the idolatry or the sin. God is saying, no, stop this, follow me.
Yeah. Every time that Paul says, don't do this, it implies that they are either doing it or capable of doing it.
That's right.
Well, Dr. Turk, you've written and lectured extensively, as I mentioned in my introduction, on the subject of morality. And in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, you also point out that some people argue that we cannot legislate morality. And you respond by writing, I'm quoting now, all laws legislate morality. The only question is, whose morality will be legislated?
Yeah, we covered that actually in great detail in the first book Norm and I wrote called Legislating Morality. What a creative title, huh? Legislating morality. Is it wise? Is it legal? Is it possible? Because you always hear people saying you can't legislate morality, when in reality, that's all you can legislate. Every law declares one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. The only question is whose morality will be legislated. And what we point out in the book is, I don't want to legislate my morality. I don't want to legislate your morality. I want to legislate the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one the Apostle Paul said, the Gentiles are not of the law written on their hearts. This morality comes from the same source as the Bible, God, but you don't need the Bible to know it. You generally know what right and wrong is on the big issues. And that's how our country was founded, on that natural law that Jefferson called nature's law in the Declaration of Independence. C.S. Lewis called it the moral law. Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 2 calls it the law written on the heart. So all laws are legislating morality. The only question is whose. And tragically, as you know, in our country, right now we're legislating immorality. And if Christians don't stand up, then it's going to continue to go in the wrong direction. And we're called to love one another. We're called to love our neighbor. That means from a political perspective, you have to add your voice to the political voices out there and say, we ought to go in this direction, not this direction. That's not establishing a theocracy. That has nothing to do with the separation of church and state. It has to do with loving your neighbor and ensuring that we still have the freedom to preach and live the gospel. Because, Paul, I hear so many pastors saying, oh, I don't talk about politics. I just preach the gospel. To which I say, if that's your attitude, you don't think the gospel is very important. Why? Because your ability to preach and live the gospel is at least partially dependent on the laws made in Washington, the laws made in your state governments, and the laws made in your local governments. I mean, if you don't think so, you can go to some of the countries I've been to. I've been to Iran. I've been to Saudi Arabia. I've been to China. We can't have the Bible and Theology podcast in Iran. We can't have Dallas Theological Seminary in North Korea. We can't even have the First Baptist Church of Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. Why? Because politically, they've ruled it out. So politics affects our ability not only to live the gospel, but to preach the gospel. And that's why we need to be engaged.
Very good point. I really appreciate that point, that all legislation is legislating morality. And that is a talking point of many from certain political ideologies, right? That we want to protect our children, and we have to legislate morality to protect our children, and as you mentioned, the other aspects of freedom to preach and teach the truth. So we don't want to retreat from society. We do have a segment of Christianity that does do that, right?
Yeah, and I always ask people, what area of their life, if you're a Christian, does Jesus not reign over? Should be every area of your life, including how you vote, including whether you're engaged in the political cycle or not. You know, in Canada right now, the Bible's political, as you know. You can't preach certain verses in the Bible. What are pastors in Canada going to do? Oh, now the Bible's political. I can't even talk about the Bible. I mean, it's just, the logic isn't there for people saying we ought not get engaged. No, if we're going to love our neighbor, if we're going to love the gospel, if we're going to love freedom to preach and live the gospel, we've got to be engaged politically.
Yeah, and I think Paul argues that we need to be the best citizen.
That's right.
In Romans, a good understanding of Christianity is saying, I'm going to be the best citizen. And well, let's talk more about morality. You have a chapter devoted to the moral argument, and you've entitled that chapter Mother Teresa versus Hitler. Please explain for our listeners how the issue of the existence of good and evil must point to a God.
Yes, well, a lot of people will say there can't be a good God because there's too much evil in the world. To which C.S. Lewis said, when I was an atheist, he said, my argument was that there was too much injustice in the world. And then he realized that he couldn't know injustice unless he knew justice. He said, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? In other words, there can't be evil unless there's good, but there can't be good in an objective way unless there's God. So evil doesn't disprove God. Evil may prove there's a devil out there, but there would be no such thing as evil unless there was a standard of good. And you might say, well, why does evil require good to exist? Well, Augustine, as you know, struggled with this until he realized that evil is not a thing in itself. It's a lack or privation in a good thing. Evil is like cancer. If you take all the cancer out of a good body, you've got a better body. What happens if you take all the body out of the cancer? You got nothing, you see. In other words, evil can only exist as a kind of a parasite in a good thing. Evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of a car, you got a better car. But if you take all the car out of the rust, what do you got? You got a Pinto, right? No, you got nothing. It doesn't exist. And so if there's evil in the world, and we all agree there is, we're presupposing good. But as soon as we presuppose good, we're back to some standard, some objective standard, which can only exist if God exists. Because, look, if there is no God, everything's just a matter of opinion, right? Torturing babies for fun is just a matter of opinion. Raping people, just a matter of opinion. Murder, just a matter of opinion. We all know these aren't just a matter of opinion. We all know we're obligated not to murder. We're obligated not to torture babies for fun. We're obligated not to rape. If that's the case, then the only way those can be obligations, if there's a person whose nature is the standard of goodness and righteousness that we're obligated to obey. If there's no personal being whose essence is goodness, we have no obligations. That person who can give us obligations can only be God. So the whole chapter talks about the difference between Mother Teresa and Hitler and why we know Mother Teresa was better than Hitler, because there's a standard beyond both of them, and that standard is God's nature.
Very good. And I love the fact that Paul makes that argument as well, right, in Romans. I think two of the strongest arguments for apologetics yet today is what Paul used, the moral law within us and creation around us.
Romans is such a brilliant book. I mean, he starts with you get creation in chapter 1, you get conscience in chapter 2, and then you get Christ in chapter 3, right? He goes from creation to conscience to Christ, and of course, Christ is our ultimate savior. So I love the book of Romans. It's, if you could just give one theological book to read, one theological book to read, it would be the book of Romans.
And so would you say that you can tell someone that they do believe God exists? You've just suppressed that? As Paul says?
Yeah. Well, I thought a lot about this. I'd love to get your insights on this too, Dr. Weaver. And that is, I think everybody, as soon as they're old enough to know that there's a creation, knows there's a creator. But I also think that if you follow Paul's logic in Romans chapter 1, that there are people out there who have suppressed the truth long enough that God gives up on them. And at the end of Romans chapter 1, he says they're not only doing evil, they're cheering on other people who do evil. I think there are people out there right now who don't know God exists anymore because they've suppressed him so much that God has given them up to their own desires. So I think we all start knowing there's a God, but at some point, for some, they no longer know that. Do you think that's a fair interpretation of the text?
I think so. And I certainly, we have culture as well as contributing to that, right? Previous generations have suppressed the truth for so long, and make it easier to suppress that truth if you're born into a situation where your parents or your culture has suppressed that as well. So, but yeah, I think ultimately everyone starts knowing, are without excuse. Obviously, that's Paul's overarching argument. Creation and conscience, or the moral law, point to a creator.
You know, it's interesting. Doug Axe, who is a microbiologist, wrote a book, 5-6 years ago called Undeniable. And he makes the point in the book that even kids who are brought up in atheistic homes, when they see something like a butterfly or a hummingbird, they immediately make the connection. Somebody created that. And they have to be talked out of it by their atheistic parents. I mean, we're born with the natural knowledge that every effect has a cause. And when we see these incredible effects, we think there's got to be a cause for all this. In fact, it seems to me the first verse of the Bible presupposes we know cause and effect. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we go, okay, that makes sense, right? Things don't happen without a cause. And things that come to be need a cause. Obviously, God doesn't need a cause because he never came to be. He's the uncaused first cause. But when we see created contingent things, even little kids go, got to be created.
And I think that's why camping ministry is so effective around the world, and because you're bringing people out of the cement buildings that were created by people, and you have to see the creation around you and recognize, this didn't just happen by chance, right? Which is related to my next question. You have a helpful chapter about divine design and how intelligent design must point to an intelligent designer. Would you elaborate further?
Sure. Well, in addition to the universe having a beginning, it also had a beginning with extreme precision. In fact, even Stephen Hawking, who was an atheist, said if the expansion rate of the universe was different by 1,000 million a second after the Big Bang, the creation event, the universe would have collapsed back on itself or never developed galaxies. In other words, scientists have discovered in the past several decades that the universe is precisely fine-tuned, that if you were to change any one of a number of factors virtually imperceptibly about our universe, either the universe wouldn't exist, or if it did exist, it couldn't support life. And the question is, what could have fine-tuned the universe to this kind of precision? In fact, let me just give one example of the level of precision other than the one I just gave, and that is the relationship between the strong nuclear force and gravity is fine-tuned to 1 in 10 to the 40th power. That's 1 part in 1 with 40 zeros following it. Now, I can't get my head around that number, so let me give you an illustration. If you were to take the entire North American continent from Central America all the way to Greenland, stack it in dimes to the surface of the moon, so that's 238,000 miles up. Then do that on 1 billion other North American continents. Take all those piles of dimes, put them into one huge pile, mark 1 dime red, mix it in, blindfold a friend, throw him on the pile, have him randomly pick a dime. The chance that he would pick that 1 red marked dime is 1 chance in 10 to the 40th power. Is he going to pick that dime? No, he's not. Okay. There is virtually 0 chance that this particular universe came into existence in a fine-tuned way without intelligence. There's an intelligence out there. And by the way, atheists are admitting this, Paul. When I debated Christopher Hitchens, 15 years or so ago, he was a big atheist at the time. He said, yeah, this is the hardest one to answer, the fine-tuning of the universe. Not to mention the fact that every one of our cells has a genetic code, a genome, a software program, 3.5 billion letters long. All the letters are in the right order. You say, well, that's a God of the gaps argument. No, it's not. We're not arguing for what we don't know. We're arguing for what we do know. When you're walking along the beach and you see John Loves Mary in the sand, you don't think the waves did that or the crabs came out of the water and made that message. You know that message came from an intelligent being. And that's what? That's a handful of letters, right? DNA is basically a bunch of letters lined up that, these chemical nucleotides lined up. It's a 1-to-1 relationship. It's like a software program. And when you have 3.5 billion letters lined up, all in the right order, you say the same thing. It's got to come from intelligence, because messages only come from minds. So those are 2 aspects of the design argument. The fact that the universe is fine-tuned and life itself appears to be the product of intelligence as well.
Yeah, I love the William Paley's watch illustration, right? That several parts are framed in such a way you don't come across a watch and think it just appeared out of nowhere.
That's right.
Someone created that, an intelligent designer. Well, our time is up for today's episode, but we're not finished discussing Dr. Turek's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Up to this point, we have been discussing the arguments and evidence for the existence of God. And that is, of course, a crucial first step to faith in the Judeo-Christian God and ultimately in the person of Jesus Christ. But belief in God alone is not enough. In next week's episode, we will discuss arguments for the Judeo-Christian faith. You won't want to miss it. But in the meantime, you'll want to jump online and acquire your own copy of Dr. Turek's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know that international missions and leadership development is very near to my heart. I cannot think of a more strategic way to make an eternal impact on an entire country than by training its Christian leaders for the work of the ministry. And that is why I'm so happy to partner with the National Theological College and Graduate School as a volunteer professor of Bible and theology and board member. NTCGS is a strategically placed college and graduate school with 3 campuses in the Middle East and 1 in East Africa. We're training Egyptians, Jordanians, Syrians, Lebanese, and East Africans in the Scriptures. If you'd like to join me in partnering with NTCGS through your prayers or your giving, please go to ntcgs.org. That's ntcgs.org. And if you'd like to help me with my costs of the upcoming trip, my teaching trip to Jordan, 27 hours on the book of Acts. I'll be teaching these Arabic-speaking students. You can go to pauldweaver.com and click on the Give link. That's pauldweaver.com and click on the Give link. Thank you so much for your consideration. I hope you'll join Dr. Turk and me again next week for another great podcast. But until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.